Hey guys, what's up? Public here, back with another video, and today I want to give you the Void Eruption Ghost Priority build for Shadow Priest inside of Mythic Plus for Season 3 of Dragonflight. I'm going to talk about when this build works, when it doesn't, what it's good at, what it's not good at, kind of dive into how some of the mechanics work, and some of the choices with your talent tree with the build, while also showing some gameplay of this build and a few keys that I've run. So let's dive in. Okay, first things first, let's actually talk about the talent tree itself. While I'm going over it, I'll show you some footage of the build in action on the left, and you'll just see the talent tree on the right as I kind of talk through things. So for this build, it's going to have the same kind of skeleton structure as most of the other builds. If you haven't already seen it in the Icy Veins guide, this is basically what that looks like. So in the first section here, pretty standard stuff. You're always going to take this stuff, although some keys maybe you can afford to drop silence. I will say this build is kind of geared towards more high-end keys, and for that environment, we're always going to select Mental Fortitude here. And I'm mostly doing that to show you what you would pick if you actually want to take that and silence in this case. So the rest of the build, as I mentioned, it is a Void Eruption build, so we're always going to be taking that. Mythic Plus, always going to have Shadow Crash. Same thing with Shadowy Insight. So this is the kind of bare bones skeleton from here. You have a couple choices to make, and we'll kind of walk through some of those now. The first one is whether or not you want to run Mind Spike or not. Generally speaking, that kind of hinges on other choices that you're making inside of the build. For the Ghost Priority build variant of what a lot of people run in like really super high keys that focuses on Yogg-Saron, I generally speaking see a lot of things. People want Mind's Eye. The reason why you want Mind's Eye is for the increased priority target damage that you get from this. It's kind of, you can still play like, I'm going to use all of my Devouring Plagues on one target with Destroyed Reality, although it's definitely not what it's strong at. So if you're really trying to index into single target priority damage inside of AoE, you kind of want to go on Mind's Eye. The reason why I bring that up, what I'm actually seeing is inside of Sims for a wide variety of things, Mind Spike is significantly outperforming Mind Flay for this build anytime you're picking up Mind's Eye specifically. So we're going to kind of assume that we're going to do that in this build. From here, this build also likes running Maddening Touch, and we'll kind of get to that in a second. And then, generally speaking, Ancient Madness is a good default point here, although there is some flexibility here if you really don't like the way the Ancient Madness works. I find it gives you a bit more burst inside of your Void Form builds, but, you know, if you prefer some other kind of talent, you can for sure swap that out. It is considered a flex point. And then we have one other point to kind of put anywhere else in the build. Sims tend to lean towards Phantasmal Pathogen for this last point. Although I have seen, you can move that point to Dark Evangelism, Mind Devour, or even Mental Decay if you really want to focus in on single target. But this is the kind of standard setup that I see with the build. And then coming down the tree, we run Auspicious Spirits and Tormented Spirits down to Idol of Yogg-Saron. And as part of kind of finishing the build out, we also went N'Zoth. We pick up Screams of the Void and Idol of N'Zoth. Screams actually does pretty well with Mind's Eye specifically. You're just casting more Devouring Plagues. You get better uptime with Screams of the Void. All plays together with Maddening Touch as well. Now the other kind of leftover points of the build, we have a couple left to spend, are mostly here because of our current tier set. Our current tier set really loves Death Speaker, especially with Mindbender and Inescapable Torment. So that's where we dump the last 3 points of the build. And this is kind of your standard default setup with Mind's Eye. Now, this variant, like I said, has a couple different options of things that you can do differently depending on what you're actually trying to do in the key. So the next thing to talk about is the variant with Distorted Reality. Okay, so like I mentioned, you can also take Distorted Reality. Now, Distorted Reality, strictly speaking, is not going to be the best for single target priority damage inside of AoE. Typically with Distorted Reality, this means you want to actually spread Devouring Plague as you get enough Insanity. So part of this build is mostly identifying in that priority target damage, but you can adjust this if you're actually just trying to min-max overall damage in the key or do as much damage as possible. Distorted Reality is generally, just strictly speaking, better at AoE, single target, dungeon overall compared to Mind's Eye, but it is lacking in the priority damage component. So depending on what you're looking for, this might not be what you want. You might be willing to sacrifice that overall damage to get more priority damage in AoE. If you haven't seen my latest video on that, I go over that in more detail. You can get more info on that. So as far as Distorted Reality, if we're going to pick this up, we actually immediately see a shift here where Mind Flay starts doing really, really well with Distorted Reality in this build. So we're going to talent out of Mind Spike and Mind Melt, and instead we're going to path through Void Touch to get into Distorted Reality. Now, the other thing that changes with this build is because we're using Distorted Reality, we actually see a shift from Maddening Touch to Mind Devour. And if you've been playing Void Eruption at all in this Distorted Reality style, that this should be pretty familiar. This is the kind of default setup there just because of how the synergy with Mind Devourer lets you spread your Devouring Plagues even more, which is why that pickup is pretty popular. And the last thing we do to finish off the build is cap off Phantasmal Pathogen. This actually, again, has great synergy with Distorted Reality, which is part of the reason why this is better for overall damage, while also being good for single target damage. Because we're spreading our Devouring Plagues, we get more value out of Phantasmal Pathogen, whereas before you would only get this on the single target that you're trying to prioritize down. And the rest of the build stays the same. You still pick up Yogg-Saron, Screams, N'Zoth, and then these last 3 points stay the same as well. So this is the variant with Distorted Reality. Again, kind of leaning more into more overall damage. So you kind of have a choice with this build. Do you want to do more priority target damage, run the Mind's Eye variant with Mind Spike? Or do you want the kind of topping overall like type idea if you're pulling really big with it? That's when Distorted Reality comes in with Mind Flay. Okay, so now that we know what the build is and kind of how the talents work, let's talk about why you might want to take this build. So this build is, strictly speaking, not my default build suggestion for most people. This is definitely indexed in more of a high key pushing environment, particularly on fortified weeks. That's when you're able to kind of unlock the power of this build, really in those kind of coordinated group compositions in like, 28s or higher fortified weeks. And the reason for that is purely because of the loss in this build that you take running in pure single target. Especially with having to get extra utility points and other things, you're just not getting things that excel the build forward in single target as much. Void Eruption, generally speaking, is not used in raids for that reason. You're looking at roughly a 6 to 9% single target loss by taking this build, which is why when you run it, you need to be extra careful if that makes sense for your group. Especially on tyrannical weeks, that kind of a loss can be kind of heavy. But when you're, pulling mass AoE packs, you can get upwards of 4 to 10% more damage, depending on if you're taking the Mind's Eye variant or the Distorted Reality variant. And this build is really, really good at priority target damage. So you have some trade-offs here. It's not going to be a build that I think is going to work for everyone in every key environment. If you're just doing like your weekly 20 or you're just starting to get into pushing keys in that kind of 24, 25 range, this build is probably going to make your damage suffer a little bit, and I wouldn't suggest starting with it. But if you can pull around your cooldowns, you can still get good value out of this build in just about any environment. It just means you have to be way more coordinated than you might be with another build like the Dark Ascension version. So not a good starting build for a lot of people, but I think it's a fun option, especially if you're looking for Void Form on fortified weeks, particularly in that kind of high key range. And the reason why I say you need to be a bit more coordinated with it is if you don't know what the pulls are in the dungeon, you can really scuff your and your group's damage with this. So in particular, this build suffers a lot more if you don't have cooldowns with Lust. With the boss, you're going to lose a lot more just because the windows that line up aren't quite as clean. Whereas with the Dark Ascension version, you have stuff to press every minute, so you can kind of naturally fit in damage easier in the key. Whereas this is a strict 2-minute timer build. And more importantly, when you use your cooldowns, they're going to last considerably longer than Dark Ascension does. Usually almost twice as long with Void Form, which means if the pack is dying too quickly, you're not going to get good value out of this build, which is why I typically say starting at like 28 plus range is when you can get good value out of this, especially in dungeons like Blackrook Hold or Everbloom, even Throne of the Tides as well on Fortified, just because in those dungeons, it is easier to either chain pull or just pull large packs of mobs at once together and actually do relevant damage in that pack. So that's kind of when this build makes sense. So to recap the kind of strengths of this build, it's great AoE damage, mostly revolving around not only dots, shadowy apparitions, great psychic link damage as well. So it kind of gives you 3 distinct buckets of damage. So you don't put all of your eggs into the psychic link basket, for example. And again, does pretty well in things like Blackrook Hold. And also I'd say Galakrond's Fall, surprisingly. Depending on how you pull that dungeon, you can actually get pretty good results out of this too. On Fortified, the timer seems to be pretty good. But again, you have to be careful about the boss damage component. And the biggest, strong suit of this build is its top tier priority target damage. So generally speaking, builds with Mind's Eye are the way to get that kind of big priority target damage. And then Void Eruption unlocks the next level of that as well, because you also have Void Bolt. And so you're kind of extending the kind of prio damage into one target on mass AoE. That damage pattern, along with Mind's Eye, is particularly valuable for people that are pushing high keys, especially if you're trying to fit into a group composition. So that's why you're going to see a lot of people use some variation of this build at the high key level, and it's to fit into that better damage pattern. Although again, it's not strictly speaking the thing that you pick if you're trying to top overall, specifically with Mind's Eye. You're going to always net better results with Distorted Reality if you're strictly talking about topping the meter. But I think, honestly, that shouldn't be your top goal is you're playing Shadow Mythic Plus. You should be doing the best effective damage that you can for the group to make sure that you're timing keys as fast as you can. And sometimes that means that you do a different damage pattern. It doesn't mean topping the meters, and that's okay. So, and then finally, the weaknesses of this build, if you didn't already catch, the main weakness here is single target, like I mentioned. So you got to be really careful running this build on tyrannical weeks. But unfortified, try it out, see what you think, and let me know how it goes. All right, so that's all I have about this build to talk about in this video. If you're wondering where other things are, like the rotation and things like that, I've already made other videos about those. And this build in particular plays basically the same as everything else that I've already showed. You just now have to weave in Void Bolt. If you're looking for the exact priority, check out the Icy Veins guide in the description, which also has kind of more details around the different builds that you can run with this, the other variants. Or if you're looking for other builds, you can also check out that written guide for the kind of more standard default builds. Yeah, let me know what you thought about this video. I don't typically do like specific build guides, so to speak, but I thought this one deserved its own video because I think it was kind of unique in terms of what it was good at and kind of why you saw a lot of people running it. So hopefully this was interesting. Big thank you to the YouTube members and patrons that are supporting me. I appreciate all the support, guys. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. We'll see you next time.